Info for the future. This was written on October 2nd of 2018. I believe this woman, Christine Ford, and these witnesses discussing Kavanaugh and the event that occurred earlier are also addressing issues with his cases. But he's replacing Kennedy. And I believe that there was a bunch of stuff involved with Kennedy stepping down one way or another. And if it is case law, then it would be logical that the case that would be allowed to be pressed would be one that had been accepted by the Supreme Court and would therefore be reviewed by him once more were he to make it to the court. So I've already addressed that. But then there's the fact that perhaps now the public would look at his case law history in a way that they might not otherwise. I mean, I am right now. And there's this. There is a case that I identified that was listed as one he had participated in. I'm not going to mention that at this time, but I will give my comments. The panel did not decide whether absent a warrant, either reasonable suspicion or probable cause would have sufficed to render lawful the use of global positioning system devices to track the public movements of a suspect for approximately 4 weeks. That's actually from what was written, the information about it. Nor did the panel's decision call into question common and important police practices, such as visual or photographic surveillance of public places. Dissenting from denial of rehearing in bank, they list the name of a judge. The panel's conclusion that the warrantless use of a GPS device constituted an unreasonable search under the Fourth Amendment was inconsistent with every other federal circuit to have considered the question, as well as Supreme Court precedent. Dissenting from denial of rehearing in bank, Kavanaugh J. Again, this is a continued quote. The in-bank court should have reconsidered the panel's novel aggregation approach to Fourth Amendment searches, as well as whether the police, by touching and manipulating the outside of the defendant's car to install the GPS tracking device, physically encroached, quote, within a constitutionally protected area, end quote. This is my analysis. This characterization is completely inaccurate. There is a dissenting opinion by Justice Scalia that speaks precisely to this point, and it was pretty much the female Supreme Court justices that sided with him. And I believe that dissenting opinion was one of at least 2 that got him murdered. If you combine this case, meaning the case referencing Kavanaugh, with the case that was mentioned and presumably pending before the Supreme Court regarding who was responsible for emails that were sent fraudulently, i.e., if someone is dinging you to commit acts of wire fraud using fraudulent digital accounts with your information, that might be, as I would define them, as acts of digital rape or electronic sexual assault, then there would appear to be a serious conflict of interest here in terms of rightfully challenging his credibility. But that should be handled in a direct manner and not to metaphorically accuse a person of something literal that happened years before. Is it consistent to discuss the, quote, constitutionally protected property, end quote, that is the outside of a car, in contrast to the direct connection of authority for authorizing a digital transaction that was done through someone else? A, quote, vehicle, end quote, can be a metaphor just as a, quote, boss, end quote, can be a metaphor. Then there's the case number on the case about the digital rape and that it is connected to housing set aside after Katrina. With all the railroad cases that are on his record, it seems to me like what is being asked here is how is Kavanaugh going to respond and how is Congress going to respond to what appears to be a trafficking scam involving, quote, people displaced from Katrina, end quote, engaged in, quote, crimes, end quote, that involve electronic transactions and people's vehicles. In other words, who are the intellectual authors and are they the ones who are ultimately responsible? Does that mean that if the intellectual authors are responsible, then people whom they command to commit the crimes are not? Because these allegations also get into issues of protecting the privacy of minors. Is not a criminal record supposed to be wiped out for minors after they reach legal age? Was he in college when this happened? How young does one go? If it was a metaphor about, quote, emerging technologies, end quote, his responsibility as a judicial officer, then that's another thing altogether. I am not going to look up the age that he and his friend and she were supposed to be when this occurred, because I honestly believe that this is an attempt to, via derivative, discuss a case that is very much a direct indictment. And that case does have precedent in two Supreme Court cases, one of which Scalia wrote the dissenting opinion for, and one for which he was in the majority. And I believe he was killed for those opinions. Here's another thing, though. I already know that bets were hedged on Gorsuch's nomination. As I recall, it was considerably less contentious than Kavanaugh's. I did attempt to file two motions, one of which named him directly, even if my attempt to file was procedurally incorrect. I cannot help but believe there is something that is trying to proxy or derivate that effort to address judicially legally what happened with the actual, quote, Russian hacking, end quote, onto this case. I may not have been the only woman that happened to. And it was more than one guy that made it happen. But it was more than one woman that let it go as far as it did also. So here's the thing. If a California University teacher's pension fund scheme is digitally raping her, then she needs to get some of her professors in tech that understand how that works to file a case about that digital rape. If a bunch of congresswomen are concerned that Katrina relief was connected to an effort to do human test subject experimentation connected to the digital economy in order to program black men specifically to commit sex crimes involving white women or women of color, then they need to call forth congressional hearings to that effect. They haven't thus far. If the question is about intellectual authors versus those who actually commit the crimes, then impeach the presidents who are responsible. I do believe you can impeach a former president, can't you? Especially if he is using his former position to continue perpetrating crimes associated with his abuse of office that would otherwise be impeachable offenses. I am not sure it hasn't happened before. I am just subjectively trying to understand the derivatives at work here. But who is going to bring a case concerning the murder of Justice Scalia? And how it was connected to a long-term finance scheme that is now responsible for the murders of multiple children. Because I see that as going hand in hand with the implementation of various schemes that correlated with a number of issues that ultimately members of Congress approved. And how long ago did that begin?